Welcome to our Pipeline Safety Workshop. It is May 31st, 2018, and we are in Contra Costa County at the City of Antioch Community Center. I am Roger Smith, and I'd like to share a little bit of the background on how a workshop like this comes into being. Each year, the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, PHMSA, which is a division of the United States Department of Transportation, makes funds available through what are called technical assistance grants. Our local association, Alamo Improvement Association, was fortunate enough to apply and actually was a recipient. We're one of only 12 recipients nationally that was awarded this grant. We've been able to use these funds locally in Contra Costa for gas sensing monitors for the San Ramon Valley and Contra Costa fire districts, training in their use, maintenance, and also calibration. We've been able to bring in Philip Oakes, who is the national recognized instructor for the National Association of State Fire Marshals, and he conducted a one-day training session in pipeline emergencies for our local hazmat units from Richmond, Contra Costa, and San Ramon Valley. We've been able to develop and put up a website on pipeline safety issues and for Contra Costa County. We're also getting a report on pipeline safety and the issues, again, for Contra Costa County that's being prepared by National Recognized Pipeline Safety Trust. And then we're also promoting the Call 811 Before You Dig accident prevention program, and there'll be more of that later on in our program. Now, to kind of bring into focus the three pipeline workshops that we have, we've conducted one in Alamo Danville, we've conducted one in Richmond, and now this is our third here in Antioch. I hope that you'll enjoy this process. We're going to have an expert panel for you that is both from industry and from the regulators here in the state of California. And we'll also have kind of a Pipeline 101 presentation by Pipeline Safety Trust. At this time, I'd like to introduce Michael Kent, our Contra Costa County's Hazardous Materials Ombudsman. Michael.
Thank you, Roger. In addition to being the Ombudsman for the county's Hazardous Materials Program, I also staff the county's Hazardous Materials Commission, which is an advisory board to the County Board of Supervisors on hazardous materials issues. We have 13 members representing environmental groups, labor, and industry, and others. And I'd like to introduce Frank Gordon, who's here tonight. He's our general public seat member who lives in Pittsburgh, and I appreciate Frank coming out. And because pipelines is one of the hazardous materials issues that the Commission is interested in, the Commission's co-sponsoring the meeting tonight. So just a couple of housekeeping things I'd like to mention. If you need to use the restrooms, they're outside and to the right. And also we're being taped tonight for rebroadcast on Contra Costa Television. And so I'd like to remind the speakers now to make sure that they use the microphones. So not so much for the audience, but so that we can pick up the sound for when we rebroadcast our presentation. Excuse me. And dates for those rebroadcasts will be up on the Alamo Improvement Association's website and up on CCTV. So if folks want to tell their friends who couldn't make it tonight that they could see the presentation, pretty soon we'll have those dates up for them to be able to see that. So as Roger said, we have the Pipeline Safety Trust going to give us a nice overview of pipeline safety issues, and then brief presentations by our four speakers. Then what we'd like to do at the end, and save all questions to the end, because we hope a lot of questions you might have will be answered by the presentations, but then at the end we'll have our question and answer period. We do have some speaker cards. If you have questions during the presentations, fill them out, and then at the end I'll be facilitating getting our different speakers to try to get all your questions answered. So with that, I'd like to bring up Carl Weimer with the Pipeline Safety Trust to give us his presentation. Thank you, Carl.
Thanks, Michael. Good evening. Thanks for coming out this evening. I understand we're competing with the Warriors in the playoffs, so I'm surprised that we have hardly anybody here. And thanks to people that are watching this on TV in the future. I want to thank Roger and the Alamo Improvement Association for inviting us down here to California to talk about pipelines this evening, and for the Hazardous Materials Commission for co-sponsoring this event. You know, Roger asked me to come in and kind of give a high-level overview of pipeline safety and talk about the risk of pipelines in the community. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time doing that. I just wanted to give a plug that this is, as Roger already mentioned, is being funded by a grant from the U.S. Department of Transportation, and this grant program is actually open for applications right now. So if there's people watching or here in the audience that are interested, you can ask us about that later. We know about that, and it's open till mid-June, so there's not much time to apply, but they have some money available. Really going to give a high-level overview of where the pipelines are and who regulates them here in Contra Costa County. But before I get started on that, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Pipeline Safety Trust, because I think a lot of people down here probably don't know much about us. We're an organization from Bellingham, Washington, which is right up near the Canadian border, kind of between Seattle and Vancouver, BC. Our community has organized around pipelines because we had a tragedy there in 1999. The pictures on the screen are one of the parks right in the middle of Bellingham. It's one of our keystone gems of a park, and it's kind of your typical iconic Northwest park. Lots of big trees, lots of greenery, lots of ferns. Whatcom Creek runs through the middle of it with waterfalls. In the fall, you can come up and see salmon coming up the waterfalls and up the creek. A pretty amazing place. People get engaged there, get married there. The kids jump off the cliffs into the pools, much to the chagrin of the local elected officials. And this is the way it looked on June 9th, 1999. The next day, 250,000 gallons of unleaded gasoline ruptured from a pipeline filling the creek, went downstream for almost 2 miles before it found an ignition source, ignited, blew up, killing every living thing in the creek all the way to the ocean, along with 3 young men who were in the park at the time. The note there in the middle is from the 18-year-old that died in that tragedy. That was the note. He'd gone fishing up in the creek that evening because that was his passion, and he left that note on the kitchen table for his parents. So that's kind of the context that the Pipeline Safety Trust comes at this from. We were organized based on a huge tragedy that happened in Bellingham. You know, it was similar to many of the other pipeline tragedies you see around the country, where multiple things went wrong, and I kind of have them listed there on the screen of all the things that went wrong. Any one of those, if it had been corrected in time, would have prevented the tragedy. So the pipeline company didn't find and correct these things, and the regulators at that time didn't find these problems and make the company correct them. As this case went forward, it was one of the few cases that has gone to criminal state nationwide, and pipeline officials actually went to jail for a short time over this. But as the U.S. Justice Department prosecuted this case, they joined with the parents who had lost their children, trying to set up a national watchdog organization to oversee both the pipeline industry and the pipeline regulators, because they joined with the community there and were pretty aghast at the way the pipeline company had failed to maintain their pipeline and the regulators had failed to correct anything. So we were awarded $4 million, and that's how the Pipeline Safety Trust came into being. And that's the quote from the judge there. She compared the Pipeline Safety Trust's endeavors to Bambi versus Godzilla. That's where the picture comes from. You know, in the past, since 1999, we've done a whole bunch of things trying to improve pipeline safety. We're not against pipelines. We just want them to be as safe as possible. Spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C., because all of the pipeline safety regulations start from there. So trying to improve the regulations. We've tried to improve the transparency and the amount of information that's available. And in 1999, you couldn't find anything about pipelines on the internet. And these days, there's so much available, to some part because of our efforts, that it's sometimes hard to know what to look at. We provide a public interest voice to the media a lot. I just talked to a couple of reporters just this morning. And then we partner with anybody that's trying to move safety forward, whether that's the industry, the regulators, or community groups. And we help with technical assistance like we're doing here this evening. One of our key beliefs is that pipeline safety is like a 3-legged stool. To really have a stable pipeline safety system, you need all three legs. The operators and the regulators have strong legs because they have a key role in safe pipelines. The leg that's often missing in action is the public, and when I say the public, I also include local governments. Oftentimes, nobody thinks about pipelines until something goes very wrong or until there's a new pipeline being forced through a community. So we're really trying to strengthen that third leg of the pipeline safety stool. Now just to kind of give a broad overview of pipeline safety, both in the country and in Contra Costa County. Really there's two types of pipelines in the country. There's hazardous liquid pipelines, and those carry things like crude oil, refined products, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, carbon dioxide, ammonia, and highly volatile liquids, which are things like propane and butane that are gas when they're just at the atmospheric pressure, but when they're put into a pipeline under pressure, they move through as a liquid. So they fall under the hazardous liquid regulations at that point. And then the other main type is natural gas pipelines, like the gas we use in our homes, which is mainly methane. This shows a diagram of a typical natural gas system. If you look on the left-hand side there, the red lines, those are kind of at the production side of natural gas where it's coming out of the wells, production and gathering lines. The blue lines are the big high-pressure transmission lines that move natural gas between communities, between states, across the country. And then it comes in, as it comes into our cities, it goes through a thing called the city gate, which is a place where they put a lot of meters so they know who to charge for the gas. And they step down the pressure, so it's a much lower pressure system in the distribution system. And that's the green lines there, the distribution gas lines. Hazardous liquid pipelines have a pretty similar system, other than they don't have the distribution green lines because hardly anybody has a small pipeline bringing gasoline to their homes. The other thing to remember about pipelines is there's both interstate pipelines and intrastate pipelines. The difference being interstate are ones that cross state borders for the most part, and intrastate ones are ones that are within one state border. And that makes a lot of difference because the regulations change based on whether you're inter or intra, and the regulators also change. And you'll be hearing a little bit more about this. This are just some statistics about how many miles of pipelines there are and the different types, both in the country and in California. About 2.7 million miles of pipelines in the U.S. and 220,000 miles of pipelines in California. And you can see that the vast majority of those are the smaller, lower pressure gas distribution systems. Just another slide that shows kind of the commodities here in California and the percentage of pipelines that are made up moving different commodities. Again, natural gas has the most, and then crude oil, pipelines taking crude oil to refineries mainly, and then taking refined products out from the refineries, delivering it to consumers. One of the things that surprises many people is what pipelines are made out of. I think people think of pipelines and they think of steel or metal. The reality is that in the U.S. and in California, over half of the pipelines are actually plastic these days, with just about all of that plastic being in the gas distribution system because it's smaller, low-pressure pipelines. And plastic is easier to work with, it's cheaper in many circumstances, and it has some benefits like it doesn't corrode like metal does. People wonder where the pipelines are in their community. The federal government has a national pipeline mapping system. That's the address for it there. Anybody can get online. You put in your state and your county, and you can look to see where pipelines are, and that's what comes up for Contra Costa County. The blue lines are natural gas. The red lines are hazardous liquid pipelines. And you can see you have lots of pipelines in Contra Costa County because of all the energy facilities you have here in the county. Once you get onto the system, you can drill down in, get a closer look. I pulled this up. This is actually an overview of where we're sitting this evening. And it shows that there's both hazardous liquid and natural gas transmission lines running right past here. And once you learn how to use the system, you can click on the different lines and you can get some basic information, like the blue line that's running right out in front of us here is the CPN Pipeline Company, which I think is a subsidiary of Calpine, if I'm correct. a natural gas pipeline running in the area, and then the red one is a hazardous liquid pipeline. This is the Crimson pipeline, both running right past here. And it gives you some basic information about what's in the pipeline, who to call if you think there's something wrong. Just a list of all the pipeline operators in Contra Costa County. The major ones are PG&E, Kinder Morgan, Chevron, Shell, and Phillips 66. But like we just saw from the previous slide, there's many other operators in the county also. One of the things that people get confused about is who regulates pipeline, and it's kind of a patchwork. The federal government, the Office of Pipeline Safety within the Department of Transportation, sets the minimum safety standards for all the pipelines in the country, and they control who regulates pipelines throughout the country. States can ask for authority to control the intrastate pipelines or even to inspect the interstate pipelines. And California is pretty unique because they've asked for that authority on intrastate pipelines, but they divide it between two different agencies, with the fire marshal overseeing the hazardous liquid intrastate pipelines and the California Public Utilities Commission overseeing the natural gas intrastate pipelines. So that's pretty unique. It's the only state in the nation that has two different people overseeing pipelines. Most states just have one agency, and many states don't provide any oversight on hazardous liquid pipelines. The regulations, like I mentioned earlier, really start in Washington, D.C. with Congress. That may be reassuring or may not, depending on your view of Congress these days. But they set the overall statutes that set pipeline safety standards, and every 4 years they kind of update the National Pipeline Safety Act, which they're kind of gearing up for right now. Then the U.S. Department of Transportation takes those statutes and turns them into enforceable regulations for all the interstate and intrastate pipelines as the base standards. Like I said, states can pass stronger rules for the intrastate pipelines, and we'll talk about that because California's done a pretty good job of that. And just a couple other mentions, local government cannot regulate the safety of pipelines, but they can use their permitting, zoning, and planning authority to control the way development happens near pipelines, and we'll talk a little bit about the importance of that. And just one other mention is that you often hear about the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, who oversees the rates of interstate pipelines, how much companies get to charge for moving stuff through their pipelines, and they also control the routing of interstate natural gas pipelines. The regulations cover a whole lot of stuff, and some of the other speakers are going to cover that, so I'm not going to talk about it very much. There's a different section for hazardous liquid pipelines, a separate section for natural gas pipelines, a section on spill response planning, a section on reporting and drug and alcohol testing, so pretty comprehensive rules. As I mentioned, the states can go above and beyond the federal rules, but only for the pipelines that don't cross a state line, the intrastate pipelines. And the hazardous liquid, the fire marshal that oversees intrastate hazardous liquid pipelines have gone above and beyond. You know, they have, there's a list there of better information sharing and reporting and planning for fire departments, stronger assessment requirements for pipelines, higher risk categories and leak testing requirements. They have a comprehensive database and mapping system that's above and beyond what PHMSA, the federal government, has for their internal use so they can track things. The California Public Utility Commission has done some of the same stuff, going above and beyond the national rules. They have reporting requirements, better reporting requirements for pipeline operators. They require the pipeline operators to meet with local fire departments for emergency planning purposes. I'm sure living here you know about the San Bruno tragedy. Out of that, there was lots of issues about comprehensive pressure testing, and the CPUC has created stronger regulations that require pressure testing that go way beyond what the federal government does, along with some rules for automated shutoff valves that can shut down more quickly in high consequence areas. A couple things just to remember about regulations. I think this is true both with the federal regulations and the state regulations. There's often multiple layers of rules that serve to protect the same issue. One good example of that is corrosion. It's a big problem on metal pipelines, and there's multiple layers. Like there's rules that govern what type of coating you put on a pipeline and how you maintain that coating. There's another rule that talks about cathodic protection, which is a low current that they put on pipelines that counteract corrosion. There's rules about how you deal with liquids that get in pipelines. So multiple layers of regulations that help counteract any single threat. Many parts of the regulations are based on risks assessments and management. So no two pipelines are in the same location and have the same risks. So a lot of the regulations are geared towards making sure a company assesses their risks and then mitigates those risks, because every pipeline's a little bit different. And oftentimes the regulations are more stringent in what they call high consequence areas. And for natural gas pipelines, high consequence areas are pretty easy to determine because it's based on kind of population density. The more people that live close to a pipeline, the higher the more stringent the regulations are. And for hazardous liquid pipelines, it's population density, but also environmental factors, because if the stuff spills out of those pipelines, it can cause a real mess. So if you're near drinking water sources or environmentally sensitive areas, those are high consequence areas for hazardous liquid pipelines, and the regulations are more stringent. Many of the rules, there's kind of a combination of prescriptive versus performance-based rules. An example of that is the speed limits out here on the highways are a prescriptive regulation. You know, you see the sign 70 miles an hour, you know exactly what you're supposed to do, and the state patrol knows exactly what to do with you if you're going over that. A performance-based regulation is a little different. And if you wanted to turn the speed limits into performance-based, you'd take down all those speed limit signs, put up a smiley face sign that just said, drive safely. Tells people what to do. It's not quite clear exactly how you would do it. It may have just as good an effect. In California and in the nation, regulations are kind of a combination of prescriptive and performance-based. Want to spend a little bit of time just talking about risk of pipelines. Everybody kind of assesses risk differently. I was heading to Ohio to talk about pipelines a couple weeks ago. It was just after Southwest Air had their little problem on one of their airplanes where an engine like that blew out, cracked the window open, and then a woman was killed when she got sucked halfway out the window. 2 weeks later, I was on a Southwest airline heading to Ohio, and I looked out and I'm sitting in the same seat looking at this, on the same type of airplane, looking at the same type of engine. I fly a lot. My risk assessment, I fell asleep before I took off the runway. I took this picture once we were in the air and sent it to my wife, and I regretted that because she hates airplanes altogether, and I heard about my risk assessment when I hit the ground. So everybody assesses a risk differently, which is why we won't tell you whether the pipelines here are safe enough, because you have to make up your own mind about that. But there's a lot of ways you can look at it. The industry and the regulators often talk about the probability of something going wrong, and the public tends to concentrate on the consequences when it does. So you'll hear the industry talk about how 99.9999 whatever % of fuels move safely through pipelines. That's absolutely the truth. The public, on the other hand, concentrates on the 0.00003% when something goes wrong, like it did in San Bruno or Marshall, Michigan, where 1 million gallons of oil got dumped into a river. Consequences of natural gas pipelines are well known, especially here in California, where you had the huge tragedy in San Bruno, where a 30-inch pipeline, relatively low pressure, took out part of a neighborhood and killed 8 people and did lots of damage. Sometimes natural gas pipelines don't even catch fire or explode. This is a picture of a gas pipeline up near us in Washington State. There was no explosion and fire with this. This is just the pressure of the gas coming out of that line dug this pit. And you can see up in the right-hand corner there the piece of pipe that's missing. It threw it that far in the air. So the pressure, especially of these natural gas pipelines, can do quite a bit of just impact damage even if there isn't a fire or explosion. In the majority of the time, pipelines don't explode or catch fire. Hazardous liquid pipelines tend not to catch fire as much as even natural gas ones. The one picture there is of the Bellingham tragedy with the plume. You see the guys on the beach cleaning up oil in their bare feet, which I don't think is an approved method of doing that. That was Santa Barbara just a few years ago when oil went into the ocean there. And the citizens kind of reacted and started trying to do the cleanup because the company and the emergency response people didn't show up for a number of hours. There's a couple other pictures of environmental harm from hazardous liquid pipelines. Lots of data. The federal government keeps all kinds of data on pipelines, and there's many different data sets which are kind of confusing. These are what the federal government calls significant incidents, and it's the trends for the three major types of pipelines. The blue line there is hazardous liquid pipelines, and you can see it was pretty stable over the last 20 years until, about the last decade, in the number of incidents has started to trend upwards again. The green line is the smaller, lower pressure gas distribution pipelines, and that's been trending down pretty good over the past 20 years. And the red line on the bottom is gas transmission pipelines, and they've been slowly trending upwards, and part of that is because the mileage of them has been increasing too. So as you get more miles, you will tend to have more incidents. Same graph just for California, and you have a little bit different picture here. Hazardous liquids are pretty much the same. They've been trending down except for the last 10 years. Things seem to be going a little askew. Gas distribution has actually been trending up here in California instead of down like it has nationwide, and I think that has something to do with the huge population density you have in California compared to places like Wyoming or Montana. And gas transmission is also trending up. The good news is when you look at incidents that kill or hospitalize people, all of the trend lines are going in the right direction. So the blue line is those incidents that include hospitalization or deaths, and the red line are just the deaths. And you can see with 2.7 million miles of pipelines nationwide, we're really down around 10 deaths or so a year on average, which makes it much safer than all kinds of other things you do, like driving down the highway to come here this evening, or even people that slip and fall in their bathtubs. So pipelines are relatively safe. Hazardous liquid incidents, these are all the ones that have happened in Contra Costa County since 2002. You can look this stuff up. It's all available on the federal government's website, and get a lot more information than we provided here. But you can see even with all those in Contra Costa County in the last 15, 16 years, there's only one of those that had any deaths or injuries. That was the one in Walnut Creek back in 2004. The rest of them are on the list because of the amount of property damage they did. Here's the same list for the natural gas transmission and distribution pipelines. There's been fewer of those, and there have been no injuries or deaths for those. They're all on there just because of property damage. Different causes of pipeline incidents. It varies by pipeline type. This is hazardous liquid pipelines. You can see that some of the major causes are corrosion and problems with materials and welds and equipment failures. Pretty similar graphs for both nationally and California. California seems to have a little higher corrosion problems than nationally. Same graph for gas transmission, the big high pressure gas pipelines. These graphs look a little bit different, and particularly in California, you can see that 49% of the failures are from excavation damage. And that, again, is just a function of how many people live close together here in California and in the ability to strike a pipeline fairly quickly. Smaller gas distribution pipelines, same. Again, excavation damage is a big problem. But again, there's a whole lot of other failures that are going on that are things that are within a pipeline operator's control. For natural gas pipelines, it's pretty easy to, people often ask about how safe, how close can I live to a pipeline and be safe? And for natural gas pipeline, there's a formula that's actually in the federal regulations that they use to figure the potential impact radius. And that radius is basically figured that if you're standing in the open when a big gas transmission pipeline fails, if you're within that circle or that radius, the chance of having significant injury or death would be high if you're in that circle, or if you have a wooden frame structure within that circle, the chances that wooden frame structure would burn down. And it's really just a function of the size and the pressure that a pipeline is operating at. So the bigger the pipeline or the higher the pressure, the bigger that impact radius would be. It's pretty easy to figure that if you can get the information. And one of the problems is that often the information about the size and the pressure of the pipeline isn't provided by the pipeline companies. So it takes some sleuthing to figure that out. Here's just where we're sitting this evening, pretty much. If the gas transmission line blew up out there, I don't know what size or pressure that is. The red circle shows an impact radius if it was about a, if it was a small 8 or 10-inch pipeline operating at a low pressure. The yellow circle would be an impact radius if it was a 24-inch pipeline operating at 800 psi. So that impact radius varies a lot depending on the size and the pressure of the pipeline. You can't do the same thing for hazardous liquid pipelines because when they break, they tend to flow based on the topography and stuff, so you can't really come up with an impact radius without doing a whole lot of modeling for hazardous liquid pipelines. You can use the national statistics to kind of figure the probability of things going wrong. If you look at all the gas transmission statistics nationally, what you would expect in California is to see a significant incidence 2 or 3 times a year. In reality, when I went and looked at California's significant incidents, you've had 3.4 significant incidents a year, so you're a little higher than the national average. But again, I think that's because there's a whole lot more people crammed together here in California than in places like Wyoming and Montana and South Dakota. Same with deaths. If you look at the statistics, you would expect a gas transmission incident leading to a death, once every 22 years, more or less. In California, you've had 4 incidents in the past 20 years that have involved deaths. So again, you're kind of ahead of the national statistics. One of the things that the federal government has made possible, another way to look at the risks of pipelines, is they've made it possible to compare individual pipeline companies with one another. They've just put this up in the last couple years. What the slide up there now is looking at hazardous liquid pipelines. And if you look, the 2 columns talk about 5-year average for accidents per 1,000 miles and the 3-year average for accidents per 1,000 miles, with the rate that's highest at the top and the rate lowest at the bottom. And the ones in green are in Contra Costa County, yellow are California, and the white ones are just other large pipeline operators nationally. And if you look right at the very bottom there, the SFPP system, that's the Kinder Morgan pipeline here in Contra Costa County. They have the lowest rate on the chart, which is good news. So they're doing something right to control their incidents. Some of the other ones, like the Crimson pipeline that runs right past where we're standing this evening, has a much higher rate. So that's another way to think about the pipelines. Still, the chance of it happening in any one place is really, really small. Same thing for natural gas pipelines. Again, the green ones are here in Contra Costa County. Yellow is other companies in California. And when you look at this, you see Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, is kind of at the top of the list. They've had a higher incidence rate per mile of pipeline than many of the other companies. And the one thing somewhat concerning here is if you look at their 10-year average, that's lower than their 5-year average, which means they're having more incidents per mile. Their record seems to be going the wrong direction. This is for gas transmission. If you look at gas distribution, you kind of get the same kind of picture with PG&E at the top of the list, where you'd like to see them at the bottom. And Andy can probably talk about that a little bit this evening. There's probably lots of reasons for that, and I haven't dug into the data enough to understand that. A couple of last things I want to talk about is just land use planning near pipelines. Pipelines tend to want to be in rural areas. They don't like to be near people if they can avoid it. So a lot of pipelines were built in places like this. This is a picture up in Washington State back in 1990. The next photo is the exact same aerial photo 12 years later. And what you see, and we see this all over the country, is we're building up and encroaching along pipelines. We're putting more and more people closer to pipelines, which increases the risk to those people. The county just north of here, this is a picture from there, that's a jet fuel pipeline, the red dotted line. It was there first. None of the rest of this was there. I think the road was there, but none of the houses. The houses came next. They built those pretty close together. Very hard to get emergency equipment or heavy machinery in there if you need to do something along that pipeline. Wasn't a problem because you could come in from the back side. But as the highway got expanded and the people living in the houses complained about the noise, the state transportation department did them a big favor by building that big sound wall you see there running across along in their backyards, effectively sealing that jet fuel pipeline into their backyards. In the meantime, people have been building swimming pools on top of the pipeline, sheds on top of the pipeline, planting trees on top of the pipeline. So basically, increasing the risk. The pipeline company hadn't been paying attention and maintaining their easement as they could have, and local governments didn't think about any of this as they were expanding the roads or allowing the housing developments to go in. I think that pipeline has been abandoned since, and it was a military pipeline for Travis Air Force Base, so it wasn't overseen by any of the regulators in the room. The federal government recognized this problem with development along pipelines and created the Pipelines and Informed Planning Alliance a number of years ago that came out with a bunch of recommendations that they were hoping local governments would look at and adopt. Hasn't been very successful because local governments tend not to think about pipelines until something goes wrong. So there's lots of work to do, and that's something the public can help with. Just some examples. The picture on the left there is a housing development in Bellingham. That dotted line is the same pipeline that failed in the park in our town. These houses were built about a year after that failure, and the pipeline company and the housing developer didn't have any discussions, and the county didn't get involved. When we queried some of these homeowners if they knew what that pipeline was in their backyard, they didn't. Turns out the realtor had told them it was just the small natural gas pipeline serving their houses. They didn't tell them it was a hazardous liquid pipeline. So lots of issues around building near pipelines. The other picture there is a middle school in Bellingham. The school district got a screaming deal on that piece of property. Pipeline was there first. They built the middle school right next to it. You see where the pipeline crosses the road there, that's the only access in and out of that middle school. So in the small chance, very small chance that a pipeline failed right there, there's no evacuation route to get the kids in and out of that school because there's a chain link fence all along the side. You know, the families that had kids there after the Bellingham incident, the school district has since started to try to address that, but it took a tragedy to get people to think about that, where, you know, local governments could do a lot to encourage that. Lots of information about planning your pipelines from groups like FEMA and certainly the federal regulators. And I just want to finish talking about what the public can do. And you're going to hear from all these gentlemen talking about the benefits of the Call Before You Dig system, 811. It's a free system all over the country. Anytime anybody's going to excavate, even if it's just with a shovel in your yard, you should be using the 811 system to make sure people aren't hitting pipelines. It works very well, and that's why I think you see the declining rate of incidents on gas distribution pipelines because of some of the success of the Call Before You Dig system, something the public has a clear hand in. One of the other leading causes of pipeline failures these days is called outside force damage on the statistics I was showing, and it's really things like people driving their cars into meters and regulators on the side of a house. This is just down the road from me, and this gentleman just bought a big boat, and I've watched him try to back his boat up into this driveway. He's not very good at that, and it just makes me cringe every time I see him going past this regulator. That's a leading cause and certainly something the public has a clear hand in, and many states are starting to pass regulations to protect such things, or local governments can even pass building codes to make sure that the regulators don't go on the same side of the house as where the driveway is. So the final thing the public can do is certainly help us ensure that there's that third leg of the stool to give us a clear, strong pipeline safety system, and engage with your local, state, and federal officials on what you think about pipeline safety. Lots of information about where you can get more pipeline safety information. That top address there is the new website that the Alamo Improvement Association has put up. It's going to have a lot, already has a lot of information about pipeline safety in Contra Costa County. It has an interactive map. You can look at all the incidents that have occurred in California in the last 10 years and get information about those. So in all these presentations will end up there soon, probably in the next week or so. So that's a good place to start. Lots of other places there, and all these will be listed on that website. And that's what I had this evening. So thank you very much. Who's next? You going liquids?
So thank you, Carl. We're going to start off with our brief presentations tonight on the liquid side. Mix things up a little bit. So first I'm going to have Alan Fuller with the Kinder Morgan Company come up and talk about his program.
right, thank you, Michael. Appreciate the chance to be here tonight. Also want to introduce Scott Manley, who's our Director of Operations for the area. We're pleased to participate in this forum, and part of what I do at the company across the country is forums just like this. We've done hundreds of forums, and they're always good information sharing exercises. Not just us telling you things, but us learning things from the public. So we encourage this type of engagement, and congratulate Carl, too, on his efforts with the Pipeline Safety Trust, who does this work all across the country and does a good job of it. What I wanted to do tonight is talk a little bit about our company, who we are, what we do, talk about pipeline safety, as will my colleagues on the panel, and then welcome your questions as we finish up our program. So the lines you see on the map here is our footprint. We're basically a transportation and storage company. So I'm here tonight talking about our liquids pipelines in the area, but we also transport natural gas as well as a variety of other products. So we have natural gas, CO2, natural gas liquids, refined products, ethanol, etc. So a wide variety of products transported across the country, about 80,000 miles of pipe. We don't own the product in our pipeline, so we're transporting for someone else. So if someone wants to move a product from one place to another, they can do it on our system. We're a regulated system. As mentioned, FERC. States also have a role in the regulation of product transportation. But we're customer-based. So we just don't build pipelines and operate pipelines because it's an exciting thing to do. It is an exciting thing to do, but we do it based on customers. So somebody wants to move gasoline, diesel, jet fuel from one place to another, they'll do it on our system, and we'll provide a regulated toll to do that. It's much like an interstate tollway, where you drive a car on it, how many times you drive on it, how far you go, the toll is going to be a little higher. So that's generally our system. We also operate terminals. So these can be both bulk and liquid terminals, bulk being anything from fertilizer to steel, liquids being anything from gasoline to even vegetable oil. So we have 150 of those terminals across the country as well. So that's generally our footprint and how we work. So transmission, a little bit different than the utility like PG&E, a distribution company. We're transmission, and many times a long-haul transmission company. So the product in our lines, including product here, can come from a long way away. So California, we do have a significant footprint in the state, about 320 miles of pipeline. The blue is refined products. That'll be gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. The green is natural gas. So natural gas is really our core business. About a third of the natural gas across the country is transported through one of our pipeline systems. But in California, also a very significant provider of gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. And how does that work? Well, it's coming into our pipeline systems from a supply base. That may be one of the tankers coming in off of the coast. They'll put that fuel into a pipeline system or a tank farm, and that product will then move to perhaps to another tank farm, eventually going into gas stations. So pipeline system, storage tanks, trucks coming into the tanks, trucks going to gas stations. That's our system. Also, we serve airports. So that may be a direct line to a military base or an airport. SFO, Oakland are two area airports that we service, and we're providing all the jet fuel for those airports. Also, most of the major military bases, we're providing jet fuel for those entities. And our pipelines, too, are we're able to put multiple products on one particular system through a process called batching. So at any given time, including the pipelines here in Antioch, could be transporting gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, one product after another. And there's a process for doing that, but that allows us to have less pipelines and get more product on one pipeline, which I think is good for all concerned. So the county, I think we've seen this map before in Carl's presentation, but our pipelines are represented in blue on the map. We have about 190 miles of pipeline complete in the county. This is a closer looking map at Antioch. So we have two pipelines, a 10-inch and a 12-inch, 7.2 miles on the 10-inch and 4.3 miles on the 12-inch. And again, these are delivering gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel from one place to another, from one tank to another tank. And again, at those tank farms, trucks will be coming up delivering that gas to market. So chances are, including the gas stations here in town, that product came from our pipeline system, if you're driving a car and filled up at one of the gas stations in the area. So a little bit about safety. Safety is, as the other speakers will talk about, the #1 priority for our company and for all energy companies. And a variety of techniques are used to make sure we have safe pipelines. We monitor our pipelines 24 hours a day, 7 days a week from our control centers. We have a system of valves, whether they be automatic, remote, or manual, or a combination, to make sure we can control the flow of the product in the case of an incident. We have an internal inspection tool. We're going to have a video towards the end of the program tonight about how that works and how those inspection tools work. We patrol our lines, both from the air and from the ground, regularly, usually on a weekly basis in the area. So a wide variety of techniques and processes are used to keep our pipelines safe. And this is also a heavily regulated industry. Carl talked about a number of the agencies, the State Fire Marshal and PUCs here tonight, but a number of other California agencies, including state lands, Caltrans, the state environmental agencies, and even your state and local, your local and city governments. Cities like Antioch can have franchise agreements that have some regulatory authority over pipelines, as well as the counties through building permits and other processes they may have. So we welcome the chance to talk more about pipelines. One of the challenges I think the industry faces, and we haven't been particularly good at over the years, is communicating about what we do and responding. We don't know everything, and we're not a perfect system, but I know at our company, and I think you saw that with our safety record that was shown on the slide, that we're trying very hard. We're always improving our processes. Best practices are getting better, and for a system that transports pipeline systems across the country, 90% of the natural gas, 90% of the natural gas liquid, 70% of refined products go through pipelines. It's absolutely critical infrastructure that we have. We're always working harder to make sure it's safe for the public. So I appreciate you being here tonight and coming out, and we look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Next, we're going to have Jim Hostler with the State Fire Marshal come on up and talk a little bit about his program.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Jim Hostler. I'm with CAL FIRE, Office of State Fire Marshal, Pipeline Safety Division. I want to thank the Alamo Improvement Association, Pipeline Safety Trust, and Contra Costa County Hazardous Materials Commission for inviting us here tonight to speak to you. So the Office of Pipeline Safety, or actually, I apologize, Division of Pipeline Safety has been around since 1984. And that's on the left, there's one of our old logo. Of course, now we're CAL FIRE. So several defining moments within our program. 1980, the Gale Street Avenue. In 1989, we had the runaway trail derailment in San Bernardino. 1994, the Northridge earthquake. 2004, the Walnut Creek incident. And just recently, the Refugio oil spill, which had some drivers that brought in SB 295 and AB 864. And then also it caused more work for our department, which is a good thing. So the State Fire Marshal is directly responsible for regulating the safety of approximately 6,000 plus miles of hazardous liquid transportation pipelines and 42 operators within the state of California. Pipeline Safety Division will consist of 21 engineers with analytical staff, clerical support located in both Northern and Southern California. The division is mandated by state law to exercise exclusive safety, regulatory, and enforcement authority over intrastate hazardous liquid pipelines, and also acts as the agent for the Federal Office of Pipeline Safety which they handle interstate, we handle intrastate. So currently, our staffing is we have 1 chief, 3 supervisors. With the one there next to it means we're looking for another one, and 12 engineers, and eventually we'd like to hire another 4 into the department. The final planning staffing is is to look at 38 total personnel in the department, with 5 supervisors, 21 engineers total, and with the total projected there. So training, this is always key for your people. Each engineer must attend half a dozen or so classes, which are each about 40 hours a week long. That's at the PHMSA training facility in Oklahoma. These should be completed within the first 3 years of the engineer starting in the program. So the final goal is that within 5 years they're fully trained, but usually we're able to get there in 3. And then these are prerequisites required before an engineer can go out in the field and lead an inspection. So what do we regulate? Most hazardous pipelines in the public areas, offshore pipelines. Commodities are crude oil, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, ethanol, CO2, and hydrous ammonia. Field inspection activity. We review operator qualifications, public awareness programs, construction and design, emergency response plans, operation and maintenance records, drug and alcohol programs, and an integrity management program. For integrity management, we have a pressure testing program. The State Fire Marshal was the first state to require periodic testing of a pipeline since 1985. We utilize independent firms that apply into the department, that they are authorized through us to be the approved testers for the pipeline. So if Kinder Morgan needed a pressure test one of their lines, they would not do that themselves. They would call in this qualified individual tester to certify the test for them. Smart pigs. They're effective with corrosion control. They identify failures with coating, external corrosion. They look at pipe wall thickness, and they also can look at cracks longitudinally and circumferentially on the pipeline. So our engineers are on call 24/7. Office of Emergency Services is notified of all pipeline spills and including train derailments. We do respond to those as well if pipelines are in the area that may be threatened. The OAS then contacts us. One of the supervisors, we've actually implemented a new plan where the engineers are on call, the supervisors monitor. Each notification is checked into our pipeline mapping system, and then we decide and contact the operators if the pipeline's within 500 feet of the derailment, and then we communicate with the operators and decide if we need to send additional personnel out into the field. We have a GIS mapping program, which was alluded to earlier. We can provide this information to local and state governments. We respond to over 1,300 annual requests for pipeline location information, and it's a centralized data and mapping information for all the pipelines and facilities within the state. So I'm going to kind of go here a little bit quicker because I'm running out of time. So we have Abandoned Pipeline Archive. We're under federal audit. We're audited annually. Our guiding principles is to strive to excel in customer service, protect the public and the environment, develop cooperative agency and industry relationships, treat industry fairly and objectively, treat employees as family members, educate, train, and enforce. Major regulations, SB 295, essentially every pipeline every year will be inspected. AB 864, the goal of AB 864 is to protect environmentally sensitive areas and state waters and wildlife by reducing the amount of hazardous liquid released in a spill within the coastal zone. So these are just some general pictures of our engineers out in the field and the type of license or what they see. The picture there is the state fire marshal, the assistant state fire marshal, and our division chief, Ben Ho, on the left. So these are just some things that we experience out in the field. And that if you need to get a hold of me, there's my contact information. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Now we're going to move over to the gas side of distribution, and Andy Wells with Pacific Gas and Electric is going to come up and talk about his program.
Everybody's faster than I can operate the technology.
Thanks. And also, before I start, I'd like to thank the Alamo Improvement Association, Pipeline Safety Trust, and Contra Costa County Hazardous Materials Commission for putting this on. I know how much work it was. Roger and I have been talking since November of last year. It's been a lot of planning, and it's an important topic, one that I'm happy to be here to talk about. Before I get into the presentation, I'd just like to introduce myself and let you all know a little bit about who's up in front of you. I've been working at PG&E for 5 years. I'm currently the manager of emergency preparedness for gas operations. I started at the company as a supervisor in gas emergency preparedness and went into damage prevention. Managed our damage prevention for program for a couple years, and then now I'm back in emergency preparedness, and it's been a very enjoyable career so far at PG&E. On my way to PG&E, before I was working here, I was at a nuclear plant in Southern California. I was in program manager in emergency preparedness there, and prior to that, I had 16 years in fire prevention at various fire departments in Southern California. Safety and knowing that people can go home from work safely and live in their community safely is very important to me. It's near and dear to my heart. My family's been in the fire service for a long time. My mom's father was killed in a fire as a fire captain. And what gets me to work in the morning is thinking about how her life would have been different if at 8 years old she hadn't lost her dad. She's in her 80s now, and she still cries when she talks about it. And that affects me. It lets me know that what I'm doing is important, and it gets me to work every day, like I said. So it's good to be here. So let's talk about PG&E and talk about layers of protection. So one of the things I like about Carl's presentation is talking about the tragedy in Bellingham, and he put a list up, if you'll remember. He put a list up of all the conditions that existed where if any one of those conditions hadn't existed, the disaster would have been averted. And it's true for a lot of incidents. PG&E has, since the tragedy in San Bruno, has strengthened the layers of protection that protect our pipelines and protect our communities. And so I'd like to talk about that. Before I go into it in detail, I do want to touch on the San Bruno tragedy for a moment. The San Bruno tragedy changed the company, and I came into the company during the middle of those changes, and I'd like to spend part of tonight sharing what my observations have been on a personal level of what's happened in the organization during that transition and during the changes following. The company does not look at pipeline safety in the same way as it did before the tragedy. And I'm very confident that we are taking measures that will keep it from happening again. I know that is the goal, and it's the first thing on everybody's minds when they come into work at PG&E. So let's talk about these. We've got leak surveys. Everybody goes out and surveys for leaks. Across the country, a lot of companies will use some qualitative measurement to see if there's a leak in their transmission pipeline. A lot of times they're looking for dead vegetation or disturbed soil to spot the leak. PG&E has gone, it still uses that, we still look for that, but we also use LiDAR technology to survey our pipelines and find leaks. we've definitely upped the ante in that area. We have Picaro technology, which is a new technology that was rolled out first by PG&E, where we drive through neighborhoods with a car, and it has these big, funny sticks coming out of it, and it's able to sense a gas leak at a much lower tolerance than any other equipment that the industry has seen. In our pipeline patrol, we also exceed the requirements. We have upped our aerial patrols, and now we patrol some of our areas, our more densely populated areas, at 6 times the rate that we're required to by law. Some of those areas are twice a month. Our corrosion prevention program, that's a cathodic protection on our pipelines. Basically, it ensures that when any corrosion that would attack the pipeline actually attacks an anode somewhere else, and we maintain that. Integrity assessments and strength testing, there's 3 ways that we can assess a pipeline. One is to dig down and look at it. One is to do a hydrostatic test where we pump it full of water and then put extra pressure in it. We pressurize to 150% of our maximum allowable operating pressure, or MAOP, and then we see if it fails and we replace it, and if it doesn't, it passes the test. And then the third way is by pigging our system, and we're going to talk a little bit about piggable lines in a minute. But that's when we send a smart pipeline integrity gauge through the pipeline, and we take measurements while it's going through. We're aggressively replacing valves with automated valves that can be controlled by our state-of-the-art control center that we just opened in San Ramon. And we can control valves on our transmission system miles away from that center. And our Community Pipeline Safety Initiative is helping us address the area and the land above our pipelines to make sure that we can get to the pipeline and maintain it in an emergency. Thank you. So this will go up on the website, our presentation here. In Contra Costa County, we have 117 miles of our pipelines are piggable. It's our goal to get up to 2/3 of our system being piggable, and we're still working on that. Here's a map of Contra Costa County. I think you've seen part of that in Carl's presentation. The blue lines are all of our pipelines. Here's Pittsburgh and Antioch. Just to the east side of Antioch, we have a large terminal, and we have some very significant pipelines going through this community. What happens when a pipeline goes through a densely populated area is we lower the maximum allowable operating pressure so that we put less pressure in the pipeline. It increases the safety factor of the pipeline, and that's something that you can be aware of. So because of that terminal, we've got some higher pressures over there, and but through your communities, the pressures are much lower than the listed top pressure here at 975 pounds. Our emergency preparedness program is very aggressive, and it trains all of our employees on standardized responses to emergencies. And this slide will go up on the website. I'm flipping through it kind of fast here because of time, but all of this will be available on the web. The last thing I want to talk about is our damage prevention program. Carl mentioned that talking about our damage or incident history. Our actual damage history in the last several years has gone down significantly. It was over 3.5 damages per 1,000 USA tickets at the time of San Bruno in 2010, and now we're down at 1.81. We started in the 4th quartile in the industry, and we're down in the 1st quartile now. So I'll probably have time during the question and answer period to go into this in a little bit more detail, but suffice it to say, our damage records by third-party damages on our system, which is by far our biggest threat to the system, are improving year over year, and we've come a long way, and we still strive every day to make our system safer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And then finally, from the California Public Utilities Commission, Matheson Kapuna is going to come and talk to us about his program.
Good evening. I just want to thank and commend the folks that put this together, the Alamo Improvement Association, the Pipeline Safety Trust, the Contra Costa County Hazardous Materials Commission, and my panel and my colleagues on the panel. And also, I want to thank you, the attendees, for coming. Anyway, I'm going to be talking about my program. First, I want to introduce myself and my colleague. My name is Matthewson Eppener. I'm with California Public Utilities Commission, and my colleague is Paul Penny. He's one of our senior engineers. First of all, I want to talk about the Commission's mission. Our mission is to ensure that all interstate pipeline and all interstate pipeline within California that serve natural gas and LPG are maintained properly and in good order to safeguard life and properties. In order to achieve our mission, we have to apply several standards. One of them is the federal code, and the other is the California code. So these two codes are what we use in implementing the safety assurance that the Commission is charged with. The Commission retained its authority from the federal government, the Office of Pipeline Safety and Hazardous Materials Administration. They give us certification to enforce gas safety rules in California. And that certification also talks about enforcing all safety rules within the investor-owned operators in California, as well as master meter operators and LNG facilities, in addition to municipalities such as Palo Alto and Long Beach Gas. California has about 200,000 miles of distribution pipelines and about 10,400 miles of transmission pipelines. And amongst those, we have what we call HCA, high consequence areas, meaning transmission pipelines that are in high consequence areas. Out of these many miles of pipelines, I believe Carl has already talked about this, how plastic consists of majority of the lines that are used in distributing natural gas within the 50 states in the union. 56 of those pipelines are plastic, and then 36 is the steel. Most of us usually think steel is the major material used for transporting natural gas and other commodities, but that happens to be plastic. The Commission has jurisdiction over 11 natural gas operators and 11 storage fields. Those 11 storage fields, some of the 11 natural gas operators own some of the 11 storage fields. And we also have over 2,000 master meter operators and 651 LPG operators. And some of those LPG operators are master meter, and some of them also operate apartment complex and resorts and etc. In addition to that, we have 11 municipalities. The Commission's pipeline safety team has approximately 44 individuals. Amongst that are 34 engineers, and then we have 6 supervisors and a damage prevention expert. I'm going to, for interest of time, I'm just going to skip most of these slides and go to others, but it will be available on the site. This is just a picture of some of my colleagues observing or inspecting a construction project. And among the 34 engineers we talked about, there is a requirement from the federal government that those engineers be trained and certified in order to conduct the safety assurance inspections that we do. And this is one of the trainings that we had to undergo. It's a welding class amongst many other types of training that we have to do, both in class and hands-on training. Our core work consists of inspections. These inspections can be construction inspections or routine, what we call routine operation and maintenance standard inspections and others. In addition to that, we do incident investigation, whistleblower investigations, and all the other type of inspection and safety assurance work. And these are some of the inspection types that we do. Well, after the San Bruno incident, the California legislatures passed the PU Code 958, which says that all transmission pipelines that are within the state that do not have what we call traceable, verifiable, and complete pressure test record must be either pressure tested or replaced. In addition to that, the commission also had its own decision on how to implement those. And to date, all the operators have tested 875 miles of transmission pipeline, and out of that, 12 of them failed, but which is a good thing because it's better to fail during test than in operation. And there are about 3,000 miles of transmission pipeline remaining to be tested. Southwest Gas has completed it, but PG&E and Southern California Gas are still in the process of doing that. And in addition, they're also installing what we call automated and remote control valves. Thank you.
Can we just move it? Yeah. That would be fine. Well, thank you all, the speakers. We appreciate your presentation. Now we were going to move into our question and answer period. Carl, why don't you come up and join us in case there was any thoughts you had and comments. Roger's coming around, and if anybody has any other question cards, please give those to Roger. And this way we could try to move through them as quickly as possible. I've tried to group these in some logical order so we can have some flow to the questions, I hope. And Roger's bringing me up some more. So let's start with a question probably for the regulatory agencies, but others as well. So if there is an incident or a leak or something in the area, how is the public notified about that? How is that information broadcasted to the public?
To the public, if there's an incident in your community, usually your first responders, which would be police or fire department, if there was an immediate danger to public, would come out and notify you. They would probably initiate an emergency response notification. Many of you get notifications on your phones. Some cities have emergency notification phone systems. Also, they would notify the OES system, which I spoke about earlier. the Office of Emergency Services, and then that broad alert would go out to all agencies, and at that point, additional notifications may be made. And then at that point, once everybody's on site, or if the situation would get worse, then local agencies would probably expand that notification. But that would be your immediate notification.
Okay. Then another question, any of the four of you I think can answer this, but on the road markers or the pipeline markers that people see, how often are those checked to make sure that they're current and in place?
Well, okay. So regulations, it's 26 times a year, not to exceed 3 weeks. And part of our auditing is that when we go out, as I spoke about earlier, and check their maintenance and operations records, we check that, and they're required to document that they do that. You wanted timeframes, and was there something additional to that?
No, I think that was
Okay.
it.
I'll just add to that, and we do it weekly, right, Scott? But we're looking for more than just the markers when we're doing these patrols. We're looking for any potential encroachment on our right-of-way. You saw the slide that Carl had about a swimming pool and other items. You have to continually check your pipeline rights-of-way. Particularly, this is for new construction too, because when a pipeline is originally built, you can tell there's a pipeline there. As time goes on, you can't, except for the above-ground markers. So you want to be sure that you're continually inspecting for, this could be trees or fences or swimming pools or sometimes even structures. You can notice these from air or ground patrol. So it's an important way to continue to monitor all aspects of the right-of-way and making sure that no potential safety hazards are out there.
Okay. This is a question for Carl. And you alluded to this before, that there was a study done on land use and getting land use decisions. But you can maybe elaborate on how to get a local government involved and interested in land use issues around pipelines?
Sure, there's lots of ways. I mean, local governments get interested when something's going wrong with a pipeline or when a new one's coming through, but oftentimes if citizens just approach their city council members or their mayor and find a champion on the city council that can think about this risk, they can move things forward. And there's lots of those recommendations from that PIPA group that are pretty easy for local governments to implement. Like the easiest one is just to create like a consultation ordinance that requires, if you're going to put a new building next to a pipeline or a housing development next to a pipeline, that the pipeline company and the developer at least have a conversation so they know they're on the same page about what can and can't happen near those pipelines. So there's lots of issues like that, lots of documentation, and we'll put links on the website of other communities around the country that have passed ordinances that do particular things. In our county, we passed an ordinance that made it prohibited hard to evacuate buildings like schools, nursing homes, hospitals within 500 feet of transmission pipelines, just because it didn't make any sense to our community that you would put people at that risk. We haven't limited housing developments.
And here's a question, I think, for both pipeline operators. Talk a little bit about trees and why they're a problem for pipelines.
Sure. So I was really surprised when I found that there were trees growing in some of our rights of way, in some of the areas above our pipelines. The presence of trees and a very aggressive campaign we've made in the last several years following San Bruno, that is a stance that has changed since that tragedy. It's one of the things that PG&E has taken very seriously as part of its changing how it does business to ensure the safety of the communities that we protect and that we serve. And it's a really difficult topic because trees are near and dear to the hearts of the people who planted them and enjoy them every day. So it's been a very difficult process to manage the trees that have popped up in the areas around and over our pipelines. we are at the end of a long campaign and an aggressive campaign to manage that, and we are going into a maintenance phase in that area. What concerns me personally about it is every time somebody plants a tree over our pipeline, they're using digging equipment over our pipelines, and sometimes within inches of our pipelines, and it that in and of itself creates a safety hazard for the area.
I'll just add that there are a lot of uses that are acceptable for pipeline rights-of-way. And typically we have anywhere from 30 to 50 feet for us for a permanent right-of-way that we need for the safe operation of the pipeline. And grasses can grow, crops can grow on top of it, even some small bushes. You can even potentially build a bike path or a road on top of a right-of-way. So there are a lot of uses for rights-of-way. The trees are a problem, number one, because of the roots. Could potentially impact the pipeline, and you have difficulty seeing the pipeline from above, also when trees are there. So the best, and absolutely understand too the concerns about trees that have been there for some time. So it's upon the operator of the pipeline to make sure that those pipeline rights-of-way are regularly monitored, so that if trees are being planted, the prevention is there at the beginning of that process rather than later in that process.
And then, thinking about trees or other problems that the public might see along a pipeline, either encroachment, or last night I know somebody asked about where there's a exposed piece of pipeline, if you saw a tree over it that looked like it might be leaning or diseased. What's the best way for them to report that problem, either to your agencies or to the companies?
I'll just speak for our company. On our pipeline markers, there is a toll-free number to call, so that will identify the particular pipeline system and will get you to whomever is taking those calls to be responsive. You can also call our corporate headquarters. I think we're going to provide some phone numbers and summary in the summary documents for these meetings. You can go to our website, kindermorgan.com. And we encourage you to do that, and there's a process there for identification. I think the woman who was speaking on the issue the other night contacted her county supervisor, who then ultimately got in contact with us. So we encourage that too. You mentioned before local elected officials, and I think that is very important because we're seeing a lot more than, I'm sure, Andy, you are too, of local elected officials taking a much more active concern in infrastructure in their communities. So we try to reach out to those folks, make sure they have the appropriate contact information for their constituents when they have inquiries like that. So we're trying to cover all of the bases for different sources of communication, but absolutely, if there's any concerns that you have, make sure you get that information to us, whether it's electronically or by phone, and we'll make sure to get someone to respond to that. We have folks in the field on a regular basis. Scott's our director of operations, his team. We also have a land team out regularly working with individual landowners on concerns that they have. So we definitely want to know about it. If it's a concern of yours, it's a concern of ours.
In addition to what others have said, one of the requirements in the commission is that all the operators, particularly the ones with a transmission line, must have line markers. And those line markers will bear the operator's ID as well as the contact information. In addition to that, we do require that the operator, if there is any encroachment, that the operator notify the commission. In other words, they must notice the executive director of the commission, and then an engineer will be assigned to that to investigate. Until that encroachment is resolved, or when that encroachment is resolved, the operator will then notify the commission that it's resolved. And I believe after 6 months, if it's not resolved, the operator must notify the commission, informing us that that encroachment has not been resolved, that they are still working on it. Basically provide us an update as to where they are on that encroachment.
And so the I'm sorry, were you going to add something? Oh, okay. So the sort of the flip side of that, in terms of where they can report information, is how can they get information from you? What sort of information do you have on your websites? Do you have any new things coming up on your websites in terms of that? If somebody wanted to know if the pipeline near them had automated valves or regular valves, is that available? Is it available, where the high consequence areas are? And can somebody figure out if they're in one of those? So maybe you all can address some of those questions.
Okay, so what I would recommend if you were looking for pipeline information is to go to the National Pipeline Mapping System, NPMS, which I'm sure the link will be up on our website. As far as where our facilities are and what the facilities are and where we feel the high consequence areas are, for a few reasons we don't publish that at this point in time. But our website at pge.com has a lot of pipeline safety information. So it's good to go there and search around. You can search for our gas safety plan. That's about 100-page, or it's a gas safety report. It's a 100-page description of the performance, our safety performance in the last year, and you can read the entire document. And it's written. It's a federal requirement that we write that every year, but we write it in a way that will be a good way for somebody in the general public to understand what we're doing around pipeline safety. Another good link on pge.com is pge.com/digsafely. pge.com/digsafely. There's a lot of information on there about digging safely around our pipelines and other underground facilities. And our number one cause of damage to our pipelines by far is third parties, people, digging into our gas lines, either with shovels, pickaxes, pry bars, or backhoes and other excavation equipment. But it's a real serious problem, and I think if there's one call to action that I would have, that I would ask our partners in the community to engage in, is a very pointed effort at increasing safety underground and increasing safety around our pipelines and in your community by getting 811 tickets, calling 811 before you dig. Small or large job, it's a totally free service, as Carl mentioned, and getting some information from online on how to do that properly. It's really the best way to increase and improve safety around a community where there's pipelines.
Did anybody want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I'll just add, I think everybody thinks about where to go for information differently. So one of the things we're trying to really do is get to people to cross-reference each other. Because you might think of PG&E and go to their website and look for information. The state regulators have a lot of information on their website. The federal regulators have a ton of information. You can get inspection reports, incident data, just about everything we've talked about. But people look in different places, so it's important to cross-reference. And one of the things the Pipeline Safety Trust does is we grade the state regulators every year. We look at their websites and see how much information they're providing. And there's some states that get a perfect score, Arkansas, Nevada, Washington, and there's other states that fall way below, and I don't remember where California comes in at. I know CPUC has really upgraded their efforts in the last few years, but we do that every year, and we can put the grading of the different state websites for transparency and information up on the Alamo website also.
I just want to add one last website, one last plug, and Colin Miotti in the back there is going to be really happy that I did this. USANorth811.org. USANorth811.org. That is a website where you can get information on actually submitting these web tickets online. You don't have to sit on hold anymore to talk to somebody about getting one of these free USA tickets. You can do it from your smartphone. It'll take about a minute or two. So, but there's a ton of information on that website as well for all sorts of underground facilities that need protecting.
One more is FERC.gov, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. One of the unique abilities they have is you can sign up if there's a project you want to follow, an interstate natural gas project. It'll be signed a docket number. You can sign up on that distribution list What that means is that in your email, you will get every document that is filed related to that project. And this is no charge. So if you want to really, really follow a project, sign up, free service on there, and you'll get, if we file a document, if a member of the public writes a letter, if there's a state agency involved, I mean, all of the paper trail that's not somehow proprietary or not allowed to be public will be sent sometimes on a daily basis to your inbox. So a really, really good, transparent source of information.
We're all concerned with our homes and our community. So we're all giving you phone numbers and emails, but those are not always available when you're out in the field. So if you see an emergency, 911. If you see somebody digging over a pipeline in your area and you know there's a pipeline there, you can call 811 and ask them, excuse me, if a dig ticket had been turned in for that area, and you can give them an address, or if you can, and they will check that, and if need be, they can elevate that up higher. Obviously, if you call 911, if in an emergency, you hear gas or a fire or worse, neighborhood burning down, you call 911, I guarantee you that our office is going to know, CPUC is going to know. If Kinder Morgan or PG&E are in the area, they're going to know, and we're going to respond.
Maybe if I could just add to what he was saying about relating something that happened to me when I was out on an audit in the Central Valley. We were driving around. We drove up to this one location to check for cathodic protection, and there were two guys with an auger drilling what looked like directly above the pipeline. Now, fortunately, it wasn't directly above the pipeline, but it looked like there may have been other facilities there also, like fiber, and so, you know, we stopped, we told the guy, you know, you need to call USA North, but all it takes is one guy not getting the message, and you could kill a lot of people. So if you see something like that, you could save a life by just telling them about USA North.
So that's a good segue into the next question that one of our audience members asked. You know, as Carl said, pipeline accidents are pretty rare, but what are we doing in terms of drilling and emergency exercises for when they do happen? And from my perspective, from the local perspective, how are you engaging with local fire departments, local hazardous materials teams in those exercises?
Well, I can speak from our department's authority is that part of the operator's requirement for their safety programs and their community awareness, they are to run drills. They are to also, part of their outreach program or public awareness, they are to make contact with local fire departments. And Fish and Wildlife also work closely with these companies, and they do spill drills. They train their personnel. They use these for, they design a scenario, and it's usually a surprise to the employees, and they must respond to that appropriately. And then afterwards, they do a breakdown of how they responded and how they dealt with the emergency. And Fish and Wildlife, CPUC, I believe sometimes, as our schedules permit, we attend as well and monitor the program and the activities. And PHMSA also, for the interstate companies, attend those also and evaluate.
So at PG&E, we hired first I'd like to answer how we communicate and liaison with our local first responder community. In 2011, we hired a team of what we called public safety specialists. They are, for the most part, retired police chiefs and fire chiefs. And so they understand the business of emergency response. They know their way around at the scene of an emergency. And we came out with a free 2-hour class that we would teach in the fire station or the police station, as often as the agency requested. And that was helpful because police departments especially have 3 shifts, and so we'd have these guys show up at midnight at shift change to teach their class at times. And they accompany with a flip book. So the flip books we want to have go in the glove box in each fire engine and ambulance and police car in our service territory. I believe we're up to about 60,000 of those books being out there right now. We do about 400 of these classes every year, and we've been maintaining that ever since 2011. What happens then is if there is an emergency, that same public safety specialist who lives in the area that they serve will go to the emergency, and they'll work with the same fire and police officers who were in their class. And they will interact between PG&E's folks and the first responders. It's been a very successful program. Another thing that we do is we exercise our emergency plan every year, and we have 18 local emergency response teams that will gear up and respond to emergencies, and then 1 central team at our headquarters in San Ramon for our gas system at the Gas Emergency Center that will gear up if there's a large-scale emergency. So and then our company on our larger scale will have company-wide exercises where we will exercise if we have events like a widespread earthquake that will impact several different of our lines of business. We have hydroelectric generation, we have electric transmission and distribution, gas transmission and distribution, and nuclear are all different parts of our company that have their own emergency response programs. And so we all exercise together and practice together a couple times a year. So PG&E has developed a very robust program. The staff I have is 20 people, and that's very large for an organization that does what we do on the scale that we do it. But they have proven to be very effective, and each time as the years go on, we've had a real incident. We've noticed how much more smoothly it goes when we go through it. So it's really been a very fruitful program.
You know, it's interesting because California has really ramped up their emergency response efforts, I think, since San Bruno. One of the things I think that was pretty famous at the National Transportation Safety Board hearing on San Bruno is the fire chief from San Bruno standing up and saying, "No one ever told me we had a pipeline in this neighborhood." And we've heard over and over again nationally that there's regulations, and there is in this state too, requiring the companies to talk to the fire departments, but there isn't any regulation requiring the fire departments to pay any attention. And we've heard often, especially in rural areas, that it's really hard to get in and talk to fire departments about that. I'm wondering if all the efforts in California have changed that. Are you seeing easier to get in and talk with fire departments? Is it like the rest of the nation where local governments, one of the things citizens can do is encourage their local governments to ensure that their emergency responders are talking to the pipeline companies?
I'm glad you asked that question. California passed a law a couple years ago that requires gas distribution and transmission companies to meet with every fire department that has their facilities in their jurisdiction at least once a year and discuss contingency plans. So while they didn't really define what contingency plans meant, meet with is pretty clear. So if the fire department doesn't return our calls, we have a problem. So what we did is we stood up a customer relationship management tool online, and we began a multi-tiered program on how we can get to all these fire departments. And some of the volunteer departments are really small, and they're hard to get in touch with. We've been successful in that program every year that we've had it. Another thing is once they found there was value to our class, it started a conversation and a relationship. And as we've enhanced our class over the years, we've gotten it post-certified, so police officers get continuing education credit so that they can keep their certifications, and so that's good, it's free, and they like that. And then also firefighters, we have emergency medical technician research credit for that, and also hazardous materials research credit. So we've added some value to the class in addition to it being free, and we've found that that's helped boost their participation. So I think from a regulatory standpoint and the company participation, we've got a very high level of engagement across our fire service and police.
Thanks. So now I'm going to shift gears a little and ask two somewhat related questions that we haven't really talked about. So, you know, Contra Costa County, as you've showed in the maps, has a lot of pipelines in it. We also have a lot of contaminated sites in the county. And so are there any special considerations for when a pipeline might run through a contaminated site in terms of how you manage it or make sure that that's not affecting the pipeline, or you need to protect workers, or anything else that might impact the pipeline because it's going through a contaminated area? For anyone.
I can start on that. I think a lot of, we need a lot more information to understand exactly what you're referring to. Because, you know, for example, if you're siting a pipeline, there are a whole host of rules and regulations and permits that you would need to site in a particular area. And I know for certain that we would try to avoid any areas like that. So for the siting of our pipelines to begin with. But if there's something that would happen post-construction of a pipeline that's an area is contaminated in a particular area, we need the particulars of the circumstances. For a general rule, we're going to be concerned about the safety of our employees when they're going out to inspect the line, so we take additional precautions in that area. There's not a default situation where that particular whatever, again, contamination could be 100 different things, but that is going to automatically adversely impact our line, our system, the integrity of it. We'd be concerned about that depending on what type of contamination you're referring to. So, you know, with our systems and 80,000 miles of pipelines, we deal with all types of scenarios. So we would have to look at the particular circumstances and determine what's best, safety being number one.
I'd have to agree with those comments. I know that my leadership would agree with me if I said that we would not proceed into an area that we knew would harm our workers. In assessing our pipelines, most of it is hands-off. Most of it is strength testing or putting the pig through. And so the pig is going to go through the pipeline and not make contact with the earth on the outside. And also the strength testing, as long as the sites that we gain access to the pipe aren't contaminated, then we wouldn't ever come into contact with that contaminated soil. I'm not aware of the contaminated areas here in Contra Costa County, but then I haven't been out in the field digging the ditches either. So, but I do know that we do work assessments for each work package. We assess the safety of the work, and then we also encourage our employees to stop work if there's ever a question. And one of the things that I think is really important, and you know, we come from a long line of hard-working, very proud workers, and sometimes they don't like to stop working. And we have tried very hard and worked very hard to change the culture in our company to encourage them to stop working when they think it's unsafe and when there's a question. So now what we've taught our workforce to do is stop in the face of uncertainty. If you smell something weird, I would expect our crews to stop and back up and figure out what was going on before they continued.
Okay, thanks. And then related to that, we've talked a lot about existing pipelines. Did you want to add something to that? Okay, sorry.
Yes. As far as contamination, my only knowledge of that is, in some cases, some of the old pipelines that were installed may have asbestos or some other contaminants. So typically, the operator's hygienist will visit the site, make assessment if it needs to be abated or not. And in some cases, it may not even be asbestos. It may just be lead paint. So that will be abated. But that's the extent of contamination that I know.
Okay. So, and actually, the next question was related to abandoned pipelines. I know from my own experience, we have a lot of abandoned pipelines in the county, and some of them were abandoned 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, maybe not to the standards that they're abandoned now. And so there's been a lot of leakage from those pipelines causing groundwater contamination, and even materials coming up into buildings potentially. So now when you abandon a pipeline, could you talk a little bit about what standards there are to make sure, whether it's either abandoned in place or taken out, that there isn't leakage of materials out of those pipelines? And then I guess related to that, well, let's talk about the abandonment of pipelines first.
Well, let me address that from our department, because liquids seems to be where you're headed on this. So our department, and as mandated by PHMSA, that when a pipeline is abandoned, it must be separated from the operating system, air gapped. It must be cleaned of all standing liquids and set with an inert material, usually water. In the past, a lot of companies set it with nitrogen because obviously they don't want any liquids leaking out that may have soaked up some hydrocarbons from the walls of the pipe. One thing that we do differently, or that we're looking at differently now, is 20, 30, 40 years ago, companies would simply hook onto the line, push water through the line, push out the liquid, and set it in water. We all know that oil's lighter than water. Gasoline mixes with water. So sometimes there would be residual hydrocarbons. So what we look at with operators, and operators now submit their abandonment plans to our department. We review those plans, and we ask questions of the operators, and we ask them to show documentation, procedures, and what goes into the line comes out of the line, and they also must pig the line with a cleaning pig. So that's how we're handling that now. As for the lines that were pre-regulation or pre-our department, those are a problem. And a lot of companies that have those pipelines in their inventory, they are going back and looking at those. Recently, we had PHMSA defined to us that pipelines are either active or abandoned. That is the only definitions. California, many years ago, had a different, an idle status. We no longer allow that. So they're either considered active or abandoned.
And do you have any sense of how many miles of lines have been abandoned in the state?
I can't tell you at this time.
That was just part of the question. So,
Oh, we have some additional.
okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, it's the same thing on the gas side. They have to remove the pipe from the source of supply and flush the pipe out with nitrogen or another inert gas. And so there are no pipes with natural gas sitting in them ready to be, lit off by something. Yeah, so.
Thanks. So now there's a number of questions related to pigging, because I think everybody's really fascinated by that and interested in that. But so I'll kind of combine these and have you talk about it more generally. So for one thing, why are some lines piggable and why are some lines not? And I'll talk a little bit more about both liquid and gas, about your goals for making all your lines piggable and the timelines for that. And if it's not 100% of them, why not? And then how do you decide which lines you're going to pig? Maybe talk a little bit again, more detail about your integrity management programs and how you decide what gets pigged, what doesn't, and how often they get pigged. And I know that's tied somewhat to the high consequence areas, but that's a whole other set of questions we're going to get to next. So maybe just talk about the pigging.
Okay, quickly for regulation, for CPUC, which is under 192, State Farm, which we are 195, 49 CFR 195, 49 CFR 192. Any changing of the pipeline, maintenance, to where they have to remove sections of the pipeline or do work on that area, or any new construction of pipelines, those pipelines now must be piggable. Now, with the construction or the repair on the system, the entire pipeline does not have to be changed to piggable, but whatever they change on the pipeline must be piggable. So that's how regulations address new pipelines. They all must be piggable, or the capability to handle a pig, and old pipelines that if they're modified or changed, that portion that is changed must be piggable. As in regards to the IMP programs,
So I just wanted to add that I think the question was, when is a pipeline piggable or not piggable? So you can just think, these are really, as you'll see at the end, the video, they're substantial pieces of equipment, and if you have a bend that's 90 degrees, for example, pigs cannot traverse that bend. So there are a lot of practical considerations in terms of geometry, the different pieces on a pipeline that a pig has to traverse. If there's a ball valve in the way, then they can't go through that ball valve. So these are a lot of the practical considerations that the operator has to consider when they want to pig a line. Now, they can go in and make a line piggable if they deem the cost benefit is sufficient. So anyway.
Okay, so now you've made the decision or determined which ones are piggable and unpiggable. The next part of it is to say, should I pig the piggable ones or not? The determining factor is the threats on that pipeline. If, depending on the threats, if you cannot determine the threat or assess the threat on the pipeline with this other method, and the only method that you can, well, it's putting an inline tool on it, meaning pigging it, then you have to pig it to assess that or assess the threats that are on that pipeline. So whether you pig it or not pig it will depend on the threats that you have to assess on that pipeline.
It's been helpful the last couple of nights when Scott's given us a little overview of the pigging process. So Scott's our Director of Operations and manage it. So you want to talk about that for a couple minutes?
You notice they didn't give me a chair. So I'll just stand up here and talk. So many of you may be asking why they call them pigs, right? Anybody ask that question tonight? So most of them have cups that go around the size of the pipe. They're polyurethane. As they go through the pipe, they squeal. And so they were nicknamed pigs years ago. So the reason we talk about pigging quite a bit is it's really a very interesting tool. And we talk about pigs, and there's a difference between pigs and smart pigs. And pigs are commonly called plugs, and they're used for many different reasons. You can send a plug through a pipeline to clean it. You can send a pipeline plug to pick up debris, water, rust, rouge, whatever's collected in the pipe over the years. And then there's also some that have brushes as cleaning pigs. They go through and really scrub the inside of the pipe. That makes it more efficient. It also helps keep the scale from building up, which may cause internal corrosion. But the smart pigs that we're talking about, very expensive, very delicate, very interesting tools that are basically like taking an X-ray or an MRI from the inside of the pipe out. So some tools will go through and they'll examine the pipe and give us the thickness of the pipe as it goes through. Some will go through and look for cracks. And some are very specialized, so they look for cracks longitudinal in the pipe. Some look for cracks in the circumference of the pipe. Some will go through and they have a GPS system along with a gyroscope, and as you send it through the pipe, it can actually tell when it's going down, when it's going up, when it's turning left and turning right, and it'll map the pipe from the inside out. And as you see from some of the pictures on the smart pigs, they'll also have little wheels at the end on springs. And as that pig is going through the pipe, it's also giving us the distance. So as that smart tool goes through the pipe, we can get the ILI data at the very end, and if we see some anomalies, maybe somebody hit our pipe and didn't tell us and buried it, we can go in and take a look at that data And then we take a look at the distance, and we know from one engineering point to the next, it's probably between here and where you're sitting right now. We can dig it up and find that anomaly. So we're not digging, miles of pipe trying to find this anomaly. It pinpoints it pretty close now. And so the ILI data that we get is very important. We run our piggable lines every 5 years. And so we're able to take some of the little anomalies that are in there and watch the size of them. If they start to grow, it could be corrosion, and then we'll dig up that portion of pipeline and inspect it. So does that help at all, or any more questions on that?
Well, with some of these other questions, we might get to a little of that. The next questions, I think, are related to the pigging because the pigging can help answer these questions, and we've talked about this at previous meetings. But, people hear that pipelines are 20, 30, 40, 50 years old, and and these questions are about what is the life of a pipeline? And I know we've said there's no set exact life of a given pipeline, but could you talk a little bit about what factors go into deciding how long a pipeline is going to last and when you're going to change it out?
Okay, so, and just to reiterate, I think part of the last question was how much of our pipeline are we going to make piggable? At PG&E, our goal is to be at 2/3 of our system piggable in the next, by 2026. And some of the factors that go into that are risk. We look in the community that the pipeline goes through. Some of our pipelines are really up in mountainous or very wilderness areas. But some of it also is just from a practical level. Some of our distribution pipelines are just too small to fit pigs into. And some of them don't operate at a high enough pressure to get pigged. So, and with that, could you repeat the question one more time? I apologize.
Well, really just about the longevity of pipeline and
Okay.
what are the factors that affect
Right.
it? So things like pressure or whether it's steel or plastic.
So the thing about pipeline is in a classroom, they will tell you that a pipeline should theoretically last forever. We dry our gas. Now, we don't operate under that assumption, but that's the theoretical assumption, is that a pipeline could last forever because we dry the gas so it's not wet when it goes through, and that keeps it from corroding. We use our cathodic protection to keep it, and corrosion is rust, okay? So as long as rust doesn't attack the pipeline, and there's no physical damage to the pipeline, it could conceivably last a very long time. So what we do is we continue inspecting our pipelines at regular intervals. We evaluate the pipelines as far as the pressure that they've been subjected to. We perform engineering studies on our pipelines, and we just have this continuous assessment process that verifies the fact that that pipeline is still usable. And when it becomes unusable, we replace it.
Anybody want to add anything to that?
Our CPUC, State Fire Marshal, when we go out and do inspections with these companies, we look at their evaluations of their pipes, whether smart pigging or hydro testing, and there's criteria that are the baseline within the 195 and 192 codes for the operators to follow. That is their baseline, that if they exceed those limits, they must replace that portion of pipe or a segment of pipe. Operators may choose to go above and beyond, as they're saying they're just choosing to change their system to be 2/3 piggable, which is a good thing. Kinder Morgan has an aggressive system as well. They can choose to use smaller criteria. In other words, say a limit was set at 10% wall loss. A company could say, you know what, we're going to come in and do it at 2%. I mean, I'm just giving you numbers. These aren't the actual numbers, but they could say at 2%, we're going to go in there and do something. So, and we all in this room evaluate risk daily. Everything we do has an inherent risk, and companies are the same thing as they look at their risk on a particular area, high consequence area, the public, and they make that evaluation, and they may choose to go in and change a section of pipe strictly on the basis they say, you know what, we're going to put in a thicker wall pipe because of we think the risk is too high.
And that's a good segue to this next block of questions, really, which is about the integrity management or analysis that you do how you determine what a high consequence area is, and then how you decide what you're going to do because of that, whether it be replacing pipe, putting in automatic valves, or whatever else you might do. So could you go a little bit more? I know you can't reveal where your high consequence areas are, but talk about what factors go into deciding what a high consequence area is a little bit more, and then what you do based on that.
Sure. That's actually a great question to talk about. So high consequence areas, what they mean to our pipeline is that the tolerance for how close to the design pressure of the pipe we can run that pipe at. So we call that the maximum allowable operating pressure. And so we're allowed to go in certain classes of areas up to a certain percentage of the design strength of that pipe. In a class 3 area, which is what a lot of Antioch is, a class 3 area, we're allowed to go to about 50% of that design pressure. So we won't exceed. Now, we may set our maximum allowable operating pressure below that 50%, but we're allowed to go to that 50%. So and the HCA expands every year because California is continuing to develop, and we've got this concept of urban sprawl, I think, that it keeps, our communities keep spreading out. And so we increase our HCA every year. Right now, about 23 to 24% of our transmission pipeline is HCA, and that is an extremely high number for many pipeline operators across the country as far as a percentage of HCA. But what we do every year is we do a study on our HCA, and we've gone from doing it by visual inspection to now we do a LiDAR analysis of our entire transmission system, and we look at where things are being built around the pipeline, and our engineers go in after we've collected all the data and they analyze our HCA areas. Very few HCA areas, once they're HCA, become not HCA. That's just something that we just pretty much have found. But there's a lot of new HCA areas, and then what we'll do is we'll take a look at the maximum allowable operating pressures for the pipes. And usually what we do, instead of replacing pipes, because that's a very involved process, we'll just lower the MAOP for the pipe. And it's the simplest way to deal with that.
And the MAOP again is?
Maximum allowable operating pressure. Thanks.
So I'd like to just add, for Part 192, the way that you actually determine what an HCA is, and it's, you can think of it as high population areas. There are two methods. We call them Method 1 and Method 2. And Method 1 is based on the potential impact radius, and if there are 20 or more buildings intended for occupancy within that PIR, then that's considered a high consequence area. So you do that at every point on the pipeline, and you look, are there 20 or more buildings based on that PIR, potential impact radius. The second method, Method 2, is to use Class 3 and 4 locations, and that is also a measure of the population density as you're going along. And they use something called a sliding mile. You go up and down the pipeline, and if it meets the criteria of a Class 3 location or a Class 4 location, boom, it's also considered a high consequence area. What California has done is strengthened that through GO 112F. We are restricting the use of Method 1, the PIR method, to pipelines 12 inches or less, and everything above the 12-inch diameter has to be done with Method 2. And the reason for that is it was intended to be more conservative and encompass more mileage as HCA.
One more comment over here.
I was just wondering, because it's a question we get asked often, and I don't have a good answer, so I was wondering if some of you can tell, because certainly if you're in a high consequence area, integrity management kicks in and you have greater safety, but the public always wonders, why can't anybody tell me whether I live in a high consequence area or not? Anybody tell why the public can't, or even local governments don't know whether parts of their communities are in or out of a high consequence area?
Who determines high consequence areas on a statutory side? That would be PHMSA, Office of Pipeline Safety. They review census data. They look at water groundwater or drinking water. There's several different criteria, and so drinking water sources, obviously that's something you don't want to put out for general knowledge in today's world. So there's security concerns with a lot of this, and 9/11 changed our world dramatically, and some of these items have been identified as possible security. So now, as for local governments, they can get into NPMS, National Pipeline Mapping System. They can sign up for it. Of course, our departments have it. Pipeline operators have a limited view. We have a little bit greater. Local agencies have a view as well. So they can get into that and see high consequence areas as identified by Office of Pipeline Safety.
So while we may not provide a map of our HCA areas, and as you asked the question, I was thinking about what of that information would be helpful for residents to understand and increase their safety. And so right now, we send a letter out to everybody who's within 1,000 feet of any of our gas transmission pipelines, and that's because the highest PIR is 1,000 feet. So anybody in that zone, if you own a business, if you rent, if you own a house or rent a house or apartment in those areas, you'll get a letter in the mail. You'll also get a bill insert in your bill, but we also send the letter separately. So that will help you understand that you're within 1,000 feet of a gas transmission pipeline, and here are the safety implications of that. But what we do for our first responder community is we have a secure website, and we provide a map of our transmission system along with all the valve stations with the diameters and the maximum allowable operating pressures for each pipeline. That allows the fire departments and police departments to pre-plan those PIRs. And so the fire departments in PG&E's service territory, and this is something that's almost unique to, I don't know of any other gas company that does this, but they are able to pre-plan all of our pipelines to know what those radiuses are. And I think it's really helped us increase safety. And the other thing that we provide on this web portal is some training materials, but also our gas emergency response plan, which we also don't make for probably good reason that we don't make that available to the public, but we make it available to our first responders so they can understand what they can expect from us in an emergency.
Thanks. And then, so we can end on time, we just have 3 more quick questions. 2 are for Jim, and then probably the last is for PG&E and Kinder Morgan. Excuse me. And so if you could just briefly talk about AB 895, and is that right?
AB 864.
864?
Yeah.
Okay. Question.
And there's
AB
SB,
895.
there's SB 295 and AB 864. There's 2.
Well, let me read you the question. You can figure out which
Okay.
one it was referring to.
Works for me.
Requires comprehensive inspections every year, or specifically, what kind of inspection does it require annually?
So it's SB 295, and the essential part of the rule says that every pipeline and every operator shall be inspected every year. So our department has taken that, and we've developed the regulation, and we've also used a risk-based system to where operators send us documentation every year. We review that documentation for the pipelines under our jurisdiction, and then we do an internal department risk assessment based on age of the pipe, history of the pipe, leaks, and operators' past history. And then we develop an inspection based on, we use a program called IA, so to CPUC, it's called Inspection Assistant, and it has the PHMSA questions that meet their rules. We then are able to go in and customize those questions to that operator, and then we go out and do a specialized inspection on that operator once a year. And every year we're going to reevaluate that line. So if they have an incident in between, we're now going to go back and look, we have the ability to go back and adjust our inspection based on that history.
Great, thanks. And then the other question for you was, one of the graphs mentioned there was a oxyacetylene accident. Do you know the history of that, just real briefly what that was?
I'm trying to remember back to the slide. I believe that was line 6, or a pipeline called line 1, which was an old ARCO line. It was actually installed in the early 1900s from Bakersfield down into Long Beach. And it was actually built with horse and buggies, and they used Chinese labor. That's how old it was. And acetylene welds are not as good as today's technology. The pipe was also spiral welded, which also not made it as good. And during the earthquake, it was damaged. The company took aggressive stance and said, you know what, this line has served us well, but we're not going to operate this anymore. So they took it out. But there was also, the pipeline didn't necessarily cause a lot of the problem, is that there was another pipeline in the area that had a problem, and it ruptured and then caused this one to rupture, and we had then a vehicle drove through it, and it's a cascading effect.
So the oxyacetylene refers to the type of welding, not
It refers to the type of
not
welding.
the material running through the
Not the
pipeline.
material running
it.
through it. If it did, it would be under CPUC.
Okay. And then the final question somebody asked, we've talked a lot about existing pipelines, but what are we anticipating in the next 10 years in California? Do we have pipelines in the pipeline to be built? Or, are we pretty well where we're at? What's your predictions there?
From our side, everything's market driven. So if there's a demand, and I can't speak for your companies, but what I've seen is that if there's a possibility that they can serve it, it's a benefit, they can make money, they can do it safely and efficiently, they're going to look at it. I know there are some projects that are out there that we're seeing that some airports have looked into making connections into pipelines so that they eliminate those trucks coming off the highway. As you can imagine, a lot of airplanes going in and out of airport, they use a lot of fuel. Some smaller airports still truck their fuel in, so that fuel is running on the same freeway next to your cars. And we all know how safe the highway is all the time. Pipelines are much safer, so these companies are finding options to make these connections and be more efficient.
All right, well then, before Roger comes up to wrap things up for us, we just want to, since we've talked a lot about the smart pigs, we have a very short video that Carl's going to load up for us that you can actually see what these things look like. They don't have curly, cute little tails.
At PG&E's Milpitas terminal, a high-tech tool known as a smart pig slowly moved into a pipeline launcher. From there, the pig began a 12-mile, 3-hour journey to inspect the inside of Line 101, which delivers gas on the San Francisco Peninsula. The tool was created especially for the project, as Line 101 has some tight bends. PG&E's Sumit Singh talked about the significance of the project.
For the first time in our history, we've launched an inline inspection tool on a peninsula pipeline at Line 101. And the inline inspection tool assesses the integrity of the pipeline from the inside of the pipeline. It's analogous to going to a doctor and the doctor doing an MRI to identify, do we have any issues on the internals and insides of us? And the inline inspection does the same exact thing to identify if there's any corrosion, any mechanical damage, identifies the precise location so we can pinpoint, excavate, and repair the pipeline.
Actually, 3 different inline inspection tools were used for this project.
We run a series of tools. We always start with what we call cleaning pigs. Cleaning pigs have brushes, scraper discs built into the tool that allow us to clean the inside of the pipeline to ensure a successful smart pig operation. After the cleaning pigs are run, we move on to a geometry tool, which is what we're running here today. The purpose of the geometry tool is to look for dents, any other kind of geometric anomaly associated with the pipeline. And then the third and final type of pig that we run is what we call the MFL tool. The MFL tool has magnetics and sensors on board that are designed to detect and size any kind of metal loss associated with the pipeline.
Using smart pigs to inspect gas transmission pipelines is just one way that PG&E has been steadily improving its gas system over the last several years. In 2013, that included automating the 100th valve since 2011, completing nearly 200 miles of hydrostatic pressure testing, and replacing more than 60 miles of transmission pipeline. For Currents, I'm Matt Nauman.
I don't know if anyone had any additional questions for, do have an expert in the audience. So do you have any questions about smart pigs? Okay.
One comment is MFL stands for magnetic flux leakage.
Okay, thank you. So I want to thank our audience first for all of these wonderful questions, and certainly that's helped us develop a much better understanding of what the issues are. I'd like to take a moment and thank our Call 811 Before You Dig representative here. They're just invaluable, and everyone should now know that they're available 24/7, and they have Spanish language translation available in their offices, so they're much more able to help people in various situations as homeowners, excavators, anyone who is intending to dig and needs to have that advice. I'd like to also thank Pipeline Safety Trust for facilitating this meeting. They've just done an outstanding job, and we welcome them back after we had such a good experience with them in 2015. And Michael Kent, who of course is our local Contra Costa hazardous material ombudsman, has done an outstanding job being our moderator, and we have several people who are on the commission that he introduced earlier. And then I'd like to finish by thanking our panel of experts, really, several who have traveled here from Southern California and been available to us over these last 3 days. I really want to thank you for being here and doing such an outstanding job. So if you will please join me in saluting them and giving them a good hand. I'd like to give some appreciation. Okay? Thank you, and also thank you to CCTV for actually being here to video this so that we can have a chance to view it later. Okay?